Welcome to another story. This is Moonlit Inc. BL. Let's begin. Chapter 1, The Executioner's Mourning. The straw mattress smelled of damp earth and the metallic tang of old blood. It was a scent Evan Sanchez had only ever encountered in high-budget period dramas, but as he gasped for air, the grit in his throat felt disturbingly real. He wasn't in his sleek Seoul apartment anymore. He wasn't looking at his laptop screen, cursing the bad ending of the web novel The Iron Crown's Shadow. He was in it. Robert Shaw, a voice boomed, echoing against the slime-slicked stone walls. Evan looked up. His hands, thin, pale, and trembling, were shackled. Standing outside the iron bars was a guard in blackened steel armor, holding a tray with a single bowl of grayish porridge. "Eat up, advisor," the guard sneered, kicking the bars. "The Emperor doesn't like his traitors fainting on the scaffold. It ruins the aesthetics of the execution." 3 days. If the internal clock of the novel held true, Evan had exactly 72 hours before a heavy executioner's blade severed Robert Shaw's head from his shoulders. In the original text, Robert was a spineless mid-level bureaucrat who had been framed for a conspiracy he wasn't even smart enough to organize. He died screaming, a pathetic footnote in Emperor Klein Evangel's bloody rise to power. "Wait!" Evan croaked. His voice was raspy, a far cry from the confident tone he used to command boardrooms. "I need to see him." The guard laughed, a wet, hacking sound. "The Emperor? He's busy preparing for the spring banquet. He doesn't have time for dead men." "Tell him," Evan said, forcing himself to stand. He ignored the dizzy spell that threatened to dump him back onto the straw. He walked to the bars, his eyes burning with a terrifying clarity. "Tell him that the gift of the Southern Isles, the tribute tea arriving this evening, contains more than just dried leaves. Tell him that if he drinks it, he won't live to see the sunrise, and neither will the dynasty he's bled for." The guard's laughter died. The mention of the Southern tea, a private detail only the inner circle should know, turned the air in the dungeon cold. "If you're lying, Shaw, they'll skin you before they hang you." "If I'm lying," Evan whispered, leaning his forehead against the cold iron, "I'm a dead man anyway. But if I'm right, I'm the only thing standing between the Emperor and a grave." 4 hours later, the heavy oak doors of the dungeon groaned open. The atmosphere changed instantly. The ambient noise of the prison, the dripping water, the distant moans of prisoners, vanished, swallowed by a heavy, suffocating silence. It was the silence that follows a predator. Then came the footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. Each click of polished boots against stone sounded like a rhythmic death knell. Klein Evangel didn't look like a man, he looked like a monument to violence. He was draped in a cloak of midnight fur, his charcoal black hair swept back from a face that was hauntingly beautiful and utterly devoid of warmth. His eyes were the color of a winter sea, stormy, gray, and deep enough to drown in. He stopped in front of the cell. He didn't speak. He simply looked at Evan as if he were a particularly interesting insect under a microscope. "The tea was poisoned," Klein said. His voice was a low, melodic baritone that made the hair on Evan's arms stand up. "Digitoxin. Colorless, odorless. My taster is currently convulsing in the infirmary." Evan swallowed hard, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. "I imagine your gratitude involves something other than a sharpened axe, then." Klein stepped closer, his gloved hand reaching through the bars to cup Evan's chin. His grip wasn't violent, but the latent power in his fingers was terrifying. He tilted Evan's head back, searching his face for a tremor, a lie, a hint of the old, cowardly Robert Shaw. "You were a rat, Shaw." "A quiet, unremarkable parasite," Klein murmured, his thumb brushing over Evan's lower lip. "Where did you get this sudden foresight? Or should I ask, who are you working for now?" Evan didn't flinch. He couldn't afford to. He leaned into the touch, a move of calculated, desperate submission. He let his eyes soften, projecting a vulnerability that felt like a physical weight between them. "I work for my own survival, Your Majesty," Evan whispered, his breath hitching perfectly on cue. "And right now, my survival is tied to yours. Kill me, and you kill the only man who knows who is coming for you next." Klein's eyes narrowed. For a fleeting second, the glacial resolve flickered. He didn't let go. Instead, he pulled Evan closer until their faces were inches apart, separated only by the iron. "I don't like riddles, Robert." "Then let me show you the answers," Evan countered, his voice gaining a silkier edge. "Bring me to your study. Give me a pen and a map. I will give you the world, Klein. All I ask in return is that you let me keep my head." Klein released him abruptly. He turned to the guards, his cloak billowing like a shroud. "Clean him. Dress him in something befitting an advisor of the court," Klein commanded. He looked back over his shoulder, his gaze piercing. "And if he so much as breathes incorrectly, kill him." As the cell door was unlocked, Evan let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. He had survived the morning. Now, he just had to survive the man. Chapter 2, Trading Secrets for Breath. The cleaning process was less of a royal spa treatment and more of a tactical scrubbing. Under the watchful, distrusting eyes of two imperial guards, Evan was scoured until his skin glowed pink and dressed in robes of heavy, midnight blue silk. The fabric was stiff, the high collar chafing against his throat, a constant, tactile reminder of the noose he had only narrowly avoided. By the time he was ushered into the Emperor's private study, the moon had claimed the sky. The room was an extension of Klein Evangel himself, vast, cold, and imposing. Stone floors remained bare, and the hearth, though lit, seemed to struggle against the oppressive chill of the high ceilings. Bookshelves lined the walls like silent sentinels, filled with grim treatises on ballistics, law, and history. There wasn't a single scrap of art, not a stray pillow, not a hint of comfort. Klein sat behind a desk of black ironwood, illuminated by a single, flickering candelabra. He didn't look up when Evan entered. "You have 10 minutes to prove your utility, Robert," Klein said, his voice cutting through the silence. "After that, the guards have orders to return you to the pit. I find I dislike being kept in suspense." Evan didn't move toward the desk. Instead, he began to pace the perimeter of the room, his eyes scanning the maps pinned to the walls. He wasn't just looking at geography, he was looking at the plot holes he remembered from the novel. "The Duke of Westeria is mobilizing," Evan said casually, stopping before a map of the northern border. "He's not sending grain to the frontier because of a poor harvest, as his last missive claimed. He's stockpiling it. In 3 weeks, he'll use those supplies to fuel a march toward the capital while your main legion is distracted by the spring floods in the south." The scratching of Klein's quill stopped. The Emperor looked up, his gray eyes narrowed into dangerous slits. "The Duke is my cousin. He has been a loyal vassal for a decade. He's a man who realizes your crown is heavy and thinks his head might fit it better," Evan countered. He turned, leaning against a cold stone pillar. He forced his breathing to slow, projecting an aura of calm, bored brilliance. "Check the ledger for the iron mines in the north. You'll find the accidental cave-ins align perfectly with the disappearance of 3,000 sets of heavy cavalry armor." Klein stood. The movement was fluid, predatory. He crossed the room in 3 long strides, stopping close enough for Evan to smell the scent of cedarwood and cold ozone that clung to him. "How?" Klein demanded, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "My spymasters have reported nothing of this." "Your spymasters look for whispers in taverns," Evan said, looking directly into those winter-sea eyes. "I look at the patterns of the world. I see the ripples before the stone hits the water." He took a daring step forward, closing the remaining gap between them. He could see the fine texture of Klein's skin, the slight tension in his jaw. Evan reached out, his fingers hovering just inches from the Emperor's sleeve before he pulled back, a flicker of fear crossing his face. You're a brilliant strategist, Your Majesty, Evan murmured, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial silk. But you're a lonely one. You've built a court of sycophants and enemies. You need someone who isn't afraid to tell you when the floor beneath you is rotting. Klein reached out, grabbing Evan's jaw with a firm, bruising grip. He forced Evan to look up at him. And you expect me to believe you're that person? A man who, 24 hours ago, was sobbing for mercy in a cell? The Robert who sobbed is dead, Evan whispered, a slow, enigmatic smile spreading across his lips. Consider me a ghost who has come back to make sure his emperor doesn't join him. Klein stared at him for a long, agonizing minute. The tension in the room was thick enough to choke on. Then, slowly, he released Evan's face. You will stay in the East Wing, Klein commanded. Under constant guard. If a single ripple you've predicted fails to appear, I will personally ensure your death is as slow as the Duke's march. Understood, Evan said, bowing deeply. As he was led out, Evan glanced back. For the first time, Klein wasn't looking at his maps or his ledgers. He was looking at Evan, his expression unreadable, but his glacial resolve showing the very first, microscopic hairline fracture. Evan had traded his role as a corpse for the role of a favorite. It was a more comfortable seat, but the stakes had just doubled. Chapter 3, The Inner Sanctum. The east wing of the Imperial Palace was a cage, but it was a cage of gold and velvet. For 3 days, Evan had been confined to a suite that smelled of beeswax and expensive incense, stripped of his prisoner's rags and draped in the heavy, impractical silks of a high-ranking scholar. But scholar was a title of convenience. In the whispers of the servants who brought his meals, he was the death row diva, the man who had bewitched the emperor with a silver tongue to stay the executioner's hand. On the 4th night, the summons came. The emperor is in his private sanctum, the lead guard said, his voice devoid of the previous week's mockery. He demands your presence. Immediately. Evan didn't rush. He took a moment to look in the polished bronze mirror. He loosened the top button of his robe, just enough to expose the pulse point at the base of his throat, and rubbed his eyes until they looked slightly weary. He needed to look like a man who was staying up all night worrying for the Empire, not a man who had spent the afternoon napping on a divan. When he entered the sanctum, the scene was grim. Klein was hunched over a mountain of reports, the candlelight casting long, jagged shadows across his sharp features. The room was freezing. Klein seemingly refused to acknowledge the existence of physical discomfort. The iron mines, Klein said without looking up. The accidental cave-ins you mentioned? My investigators found the tunnels weren't collapsed by nature. They were sabotaged from the inside to hide the forge fires. He finally looked up, his gaze heavy and dark. You were right, Robert. The Duke is forging a rebellion in the dark. Evan didn't gloat. He walked slowly toward the desk, keeping his footsteps soft. I take no pleasure in being right about treason, Your Majesty. It's a lonely thing, to see the world falling apart while everyone else is blind to it. He didn't stop at the guest chair. He walked around the desk, encroaching on Klein's personal space. The guards at the door shifted, their hands moving toward their hilts, but a sharp flick of Klein's wrist stayed them. Evan reached for the heavy silver teapot sitting cold on the side table. You're freezing, he murmured, his voice pitched low, intimate. How can you rule a continent when you treat your own body like an enemy? Comfort is a distraction, Klein snapped, though he didn't pull away as Evan moved closer. Comfort is a resource, Evan corrected. He began to move about the room with a quiet, domestic purpose. He stoked the dying embers of the hearth until the room glowed with an amber warmth. He moved a heavy, fur-lined throw from a distant chair and draped it, with agonizing slowness, over Klein's shoulders. As he tucked the fur around the Emperor's neck, his fingers brushed against the cold skin of Klein's jaw. He felt the Emperor stiffen, a low growl vibrating in his chest, but Evan didn't retreat. He leaned in, his face inches from Klein's ear, letting his calculated vulnerability take center stage. You spend your life looking for daggers in the dark, Klein, Evan whispered, using the Emperor's name for the first time without a title. He let his hand tremble slightly against the fur. Doesn't it tire you? Knowing that if you closed your eyes for 1 hour, the world would try to tear you apart. Klein grabbed Evan's wrist, his grip like a manacle. Is that what you're waiting for? For me to close my eyes so you can finish what the poison started? Evan didn't pull back. He dropped to his knees right there beside the Emperor's chair, looking up at him with wide, watery eyes that spoke of a devotion he didn't truly feel, but played to perfection. If I wanted you dead, I would have stayed silent in that cell, Evan said, his voice cracking. I am a man with no family, no allies, and a death sentence over my head. You are the only thing in this world that keeps me breathing. Why would I ever want the sun to go out? It was a bold-faced lie, a masterclass in manipulation, but it worked. The tension in Klein's grip didn't vanish, but it changed. It went from the grip of a jailer to the grip of a drowning man. He looked down at Evan, his eyes searching the advisor's face for the deceit he knew must be there, but finding only the reflection of the firelight and a terrifyingly convincing adoration. For a moment, the silence wasn't oppressive, it was charged. The glacial resolve didn't just crack, it began to weep. Stay, Klein commanded, his voice rougher than usual. Finish the reports with me. If you are to be my eyes, you had best see everything I see. Evan lowered his head, hiding the triumphant glint in his eyes. As you wish, my Emperor. He had moved from the dungeon to the desk. Next, he would move to the heart. Chapter 4, Cracks in the Glacial Resolve. The silence of the midnight hour in the Imperial Palace was different than the silence of the dungeons. In the dungeon, it was the sound of rot; here, in the Emperor's inner sanctum, it was the sound of a held breath. 2 weeks had passed since Evan had traded his execution for a seat at the ironwood desk. The reports of the Northern Rebellion were no longer theories, they were bloody realities. But tonight, the map stayed rolled. The air in the room was thick with the scent of bitter valerian and sweet honey. Klein sat in his high-backed chair, his face a mask of sculpted marble, but Evan saw the telltale sign of his weakness, the slight, rhythmic tremor in the Emperor's left hand and the way his jaw remained locked in a permanent clench. The old wound, Evan murmured, not looking up from the mortar and pestle he was using to grind dried herbs. Klein's eyes snapped toward him, sharp as flint. I didn't say a word. You didn't have to. You're leaning 3 degrees to the right to take the pressure off your hip, Evan said, his tone matter-of-fact. In the book, he caught himself, smoothly pivoting. In the records I studied before my arrest, it mentioned the skirmish at the Blackwood Pass. A spear to the side. The winter air makes the scar tissue contract, doesn't it? Klein didn't answer, which was as good as a confession. Evan stood, carrying a small ceramic bowl of warm, infused oil. He didn't ask for permission. In this dance of survival, asking for permission gave Klein the chance to say no. Instead, Evan moved with a quiet, clinical authority that bypassed the Emperor's defenses. Undo your tunic, Evan commanded softly. The guards at the door twitched. Klein's gaze was murderous. You forget yourself, Shaw. And you forget that a commander who cannot sit a horse by morning is a gift to the Duke of Westeria, Evan countered, stepping into the Emperor's personal space. He lowered his voice, dropping the advisor persona for something more intimate. Let me help you. Or would you rather spend the night grinding your teeth into powder? For a heartbeat, Evan thought he had pushed too far. Then, with a frustrated hiss, Klein unbuckled his sword belt and pulled back the heavy silk of his tunic. The scar was a jagged, ugly thing, a map of past violence etched into a torso of lean, hard muscle. Evan felt a genuine pang of sympathy. This man was a tyrant, yes, but he was a man who had been carved out of war. Evan dipped his fingers into the warm oil and pressed them against the base of the scar. Klein let out a sharp, jagged breath. His hand flew up, pinning Evan's wrist against his ribs. His grip was bruisingly tight. If this is a trick. It's not a trick. "It's St. John's wort and arnica," Evan whispered, his heart thumping against his ribs. He didn't pull away. He leaned closer, his chest nearly brushing Klein's shoulder. "Breathe, Klein. Just breathe." Slowly, the iron fingers around Evan's wrist loosened. Evan began to work the oil into the skin. He used the techniques he'd learned back in his old life after long hours at a desk, firm, circular motions designed to melt tension. As he worked, the proximity became a physical weight. He could feel the heat radiating from Klein's body, the scent of expensive soap and the metallic tang of the oil filling his senses. He felt Klein's head drop back against the chair. The Emperor's eyes were closed, his long lashes casting shadows against his cheekbones. In this light, stripped of his crown and his anger, he looked devastatingly human. "Why?" Klein asked, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "Why risk everything for a man who was ready to watch your head roll into the dust?" Evan paused, his thumbs resting just above Klein's hip bone. This was the moment for the weaponized vulnerability. He let his touch linger, turning the massage into something softer, more tentative. "Because the man who was ready to kill me didn't know me," Evan said, his voice trembling with a well-acted fragility. "And because I think I'm the only person in this entire palace who actually wants you to keep breathing for reasons other than fear." Klein's eyes flickered open. They weren't glacial anymore. They were dark, turbulent, and focused entirely on Evan's mouth. The Emperor reached up, his hand moving from Evan's wrist to the back of his neck, pulling him down until their foreheads touched. The smell of the valerian tea was lost in the sudden, electric charge between them. "You are a dangerous creature, Robert Shaw," Klein breathed, his thumb tracing the line of Evan's jaw. "I should have killed you when I had the chance." "It's too late for that now," Evan whispered. "You've already let me in." Klein didn't kiss him, not yet, but he didn't let go. He held Evan there, in the golden circle of the firelight, two monsters recognizing each other in the dark. Chapter 5, The Hunt and the Heroics. The Imperial hunt was never about the game, it was about the optics of power. Under a canopy of ancient, frost-dusted pines, the nobility of the Empire gathered in a display of predatory elegance. Banners of crimson and gold snapped in the biting wind, and the baying of hounds provided a frantic staccato to the rhythmic thud of hooves. Evan sat atop a docile white mare, his thighs aching from the unfamiliar saddle. He looked every bit the pampered scholar in his fur-trimmed cloak, but his eyes were scanning the tree-line with the frantic intensity of a man watching a countdown. Chapter 14, Evan reminded himself, his knuckles white around the reins. The original Robert Shaw wasn't here. He was in a cell. But the ambush happens at the Ravine of Whispers. 10 archers. 1 traitorous captain. Klein rode at the head of the procession, a dark god on a charcoal stallion. He looked back once, his gaze lingering on Evan with a possessiveness that had become more overt since the night in the study. He didn't speak, but the tilt of his chin was a silent command, "Stay close." As the party descended into the narrow, fog-heavy ravine, the jovial atmosphere vanished. The air grew still, too still. "Your Majesty," Evan called out, his voice cutting through the fog. "The wind has died. The birds have stopped." The captain of the guard, a man named Harkin with a face like scarred leather, sneered. "The seer is afraid of the quiet. It's a hunt, advisor. Silence is the point." "Silence is an invitation," Evan snapped, his heart hammering against his ribs. He kicked his mare forward, forcing her toward Klein. "Klein, stop. The ridge to the left, now." As if summoned by his voice, the first whistle of an arrow sliced through the mist. It struck Harkin's horse, sending the animal screaming to the ground. Then came a rain of black-fletched shafts. The ravine erupted into chaos. Steel clashed against steel as hidden assassins tumbled from the rocks, their faces masked in the gray silk of the northern rebels. "Protect the Emperor," a voice cried, but the formation was broken. Evan saw it before anyone else, the sun glinting off a polished arrowhead on the ledge directly above Klein. The Emperor was occupied, his sword buried in the chest of an insurgent, his back momentarily exposed. Evan didn't think. He didn't have time to calculate the ROI of this particular move. He threw himself off his mare, the world blurring into a dizzying rush of cold air and brown earth. He collided with Klein just as the bowstring snapped. A white-hot sear of pain tore through Evan's shoulder. He gasped, the sound turning into a wet choke as he and Klein tumbled into the dirt. The impact knocked the wind from his lungs, leaving him staring up at the canopy of trees, which were spinning like a carousel. "Robert." The voice wasn't a command, it was a roar of genuine, unadulterated panic. Evan felt strong arms haul him upright, pulling him against a chest that was heaving with exertion. Klein's face was inches from his features contorted in a way Evan had never seen, fear. Raw, human fear. "You fool," Klein hissed, his hand pressing firmly against the wound in Evan's shoulder to stem the flow of blood. "You absolute, miserable fool. I told you." Evan managed, a weak, delirious smile touching his lips. "I told you. I'm the only one who wants you to keep breathing." The battle raged around them, but for a moment, they were in a vacuum. Klein looked down at the blood staining his own gloves, Evan's blood, and something in his eyes shifted permanently. The cold, calculating ruler who viewed people as assets was gone. In his place was a man who looked like he was watching his world burn. "Harkin is the traitor," Evan whispered, his vision beginning to gray at the edges. "The coin, in his boot, check the—" "Be quiet," Klein commanded, his voice shaking. He scooped Evan up into his arms, ignoring the blood ruining his imperial robes. He turned to his remaining loyal guards, his voice booming with a terrifying, lethal authority. "Kill them all. Leave no one for questioning. If the advisor dies, I will turn this forest into a pyre for every soul within 10 miles. As Evan slipped into unconsciousness, he felt the steady, frantic beat of Klein's heart against his cheek. He had played the heroics card. He had shed blood for the tyrant. Now, the only question was whether he would wake up to a crown or a shroud. Chapter 6, The Rival's Arrival. Evan woke to the scent of sandalwood and old parchment, the unmistakable aroma of the Emperor's private bedchamber. The light filtering through the heavy velvet curtains was soft, suggesting late afternoon. He tried to shift, but a sharp, biting ache in his shoulder pinned him back against the silk pillows. He wasn't in the East Wing anymore. He was in the heart of the lion's den, tucked into the Emperor's own bed. "Don't move," a voice commanded from the shadows. Klein was sitting in a chair by the hearth, a cup of wine in his hand that looked untouched. He looked disheveled, his crown was missing, his collar was open, and there were dark circles beneath his eyes that spoke of a long vigil. "How long?" Evan rasped, his throat feeling like it had been scraped with glass. 2 days, Klein said, standing and walking to the bedside. He looked down at Evan with a complex expression, a mixture of lingering fury and something so tender it was almost painful to witness. "The physician said the arrow was poisoned, but you had already built up a resistance to the toxin. Luck, apparently." Not luck, Evan thought, a faint smile ghosting his lips. Calculated microdosing. He knew the ambush was coming, he'd been preparing his body for weeks. "Harkin?" Evan asked. "Executed," Klein said coldly. "Along with his entire lineage. You were right about the coin in his boot. It bore the Duke's seal." The moment of quiet was shattered by a commotion outside the heavy oak doors. A high, clear voice, one that rang with the annoying resonance of a chosen one, demanded entry. "I am the holy representative of the Southern Light. You cannot bar me from the Emperor's side while he is surrounded by shadowmongers." Evan's stomach dropped. Prince Julian. The original hero of the novel. In the book, Julian was the one who was supposed to save Klein from his own darkness, eventually leading to the execution of the corrupt advisor, Robert Shaw. The doors swung open. Julian burst in, looking like a literal painting, golden hair, bright blue eyes, and white robes that seemed to glow. He stopped dead when he saw Evan lying in the Emperor's bed. "Your Majesty," Julian said, his voice dropping an octave in shock. "I heard there was an attempt on your life. I came at once to offer spiritual guidance. But I see you are occupied with the prisoner." "He is not a prisoner," Klein said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, low vibrato. He stepped between Julian and the bed, his posture shielding Evan. "He is the man who took an arrow for me. What have you done for the crown lately, Julian? Aside from demanding more tithes for your temples." Julian's face flushed. He looked at Evan, and for a split second, the holy prince's mask slipped, revealing a flash of pure, vitriolic jealousy. "He is a snake, Klein. The rumors say he uses witchcraft to see the future. He is manipulating you." Evan saw his opening. He didn't try to act tough. Instead, he let out a soft, pained whimper and tried to push himself up, purposely letting the fur blanket slip to show the heavy bandages on his shoulder. "Your Majesty." Evan breathed, his voice trembling. "Perhaps the prince is right. I am just a commoner. If my presence causes discord between you and the church, I should return to the dungeons. I wouldn't want to be the cause of your ruin." The manipulation was so thick you could have cut it with a dagger. Klein turned back to Evan, his expression hardening into something terrifyingly possessive. He ignored Julian entirely, sitting on the edge of the bed and taking Evan's hand in his. He pressed a firm, lingering kiss to Evan's knuckles, his eyes locked on Julian's. "The church can burn," Klein said, his voice echoing in the silent room. "If anyone, prince or priest, attempts to remove you from this room, they will find out exactly how I earned my reputation." Julian stood frozen, his hero narrative crumbling in the face of a tyrant who had found something he loved more than his throne. Evan sank back into the pillows, catching Julian's eye for a fraction of a second. He didn't look like a victim anymore. He gave the hero a tiny, razor-sharp smirk. The hero had arrived, but the villain was already taken. Chapter 7, The Final Sentence. The morning of the 10th day dawned not with the celebratory gold of a spring banquet, but with a sky the color of bruised slate. This was the date. In the original ink of the Iron Crown's shadow, this was the hour Robert Shaw's head would roll into a wicker basket to the cheers of a vengeful court. Evan stood by the tall arched window of the Emperor's bedchamber, his fingers tracing the cold glass. He was dressed in robes of silver and charcoal, the high collar hiding the faint yellowish bruise of his healing shoulder. Outside, in the great plaza, the wooden scaffold had been erected. The law demanded a scapegoat for the Northern Rebellion, and the High Council, spurred on by a humiliated Prince Julian, had invoked an ancient charcoal-on-parchment decree: the advisor who fails to prevent treason shall share the traitor's fate. The heavy doors creaked open. Klein entered, his armor clanking softly. He looked like a man who hadn't slept in a century. "The council is gathered," Klein said, his voice flat, drained of its usual melodic bite. "Julian has rallied the priesthood. They claim that if I do not execute you, I am choosing a sorcerer over the divine law of the empire. They are threatening excommunication. Civil war." Evan turned. He didn't look afraid. He looked serene. It was his final, most dangerous gambit, the martyr's grace. "Then give them what they want," Evan whispered. Klein was across the room in a blur of motion, his gloved hands slamming into the window frame on either side of Evan's head, pinning him there. "Do not joke with me, Robert. I have burned cities for less than the insult they are offering me today. Do you think I will let them take you? If you fight them now, you lose the throne," Evan said, reaching up to cup Klein's face. He let his thumb stroke the Emperor's cheekbones, his touch feather-light. "You'll be a rebel in your own palace. All the work we've done, the Northern Duke, the grain ledgers, it will all be for nothing." "I don't care about the throne," Klein growled, his forehead dropping to rest against Evan's. I cared about the power because it was the only thing that kept me alive. But now. He trailed off, his breath hitching. I have a final piece of future knowledge for you, Klein, Evan said, his voice a soft, hypnotic lure. The law says Robert Shaw must go to the scaffold. It doesn't say he has to die there. And it doesn't say who must emerge from the smoke. Evan reached into his sleeve and pulled out a small, wax-sealed vial, a powerful paralytic he'd synthesized from the very herbs he used for Klein's pain. One drop will make my heart stop for an hour. To the crowd, I will look like a man who died of fright before the blade even fell. To the law, the debt will be paid. Klein pulled back, his eyes searching Evan's with a desperate, wild intensity. And if you don't wake up? If the dose is too high? Then I die having saved the only person worth saving in this godforsaken story, Evan said, his eyes shining with a terrifyingly beautiful sincerity. He leaned forward and pressed his lips to Klein's, a hard, desperate kiss that tasted of salt and impending loss. It was the first time Evan had initiated it, and it shattered whatever remained of Klein's glacial resolve. Trust me, Evan breathed against his lips. One last time. Outside, the bells began to toll. The funeral march for a side character had begun. Evan took the vial, tipped his head back, and swallowed the bitter liquid. As his limbs began to grow heavy and the world started to tilt, he felt Klein catch him, holding him with a grip so tight it felt like it could anchor his soul to the earth. If you don't wake up, Robert, Klein whispered into his hair, his voice trembling with a vow of total destruction, I will give them the bloodbath they're asking for. I will leave nothing but ashes. Evan's eyes fluttered shut. The darkness claimed him, but he wasn't afraid. He had rewritten the script, now he just had to see if the ink would dry. Chapter 8, Rewriting the Ending. The silence of the Imperial Vault was absolute, broken only by the frantic, ragged breathing of a man who had spent the last hour staring at a corpse. Klein Evangel knelt on the stone floor, his forehead pressed against Evan's cold, limp hand. On the dais above them, the Empire was in a state of stunned transition. The traitor Robert Shaw had collapsed on the scaffold before the axe could fall, his heart stopping in a display of what the priests called divine judgment. The body had been whisked away by the Emperor's personal guard before the crowd could poke at the remains. Wake up, Klein whispered, his voice cracking, a sound that would have sent shivers through his generals. Robert, if this is your final trick, I will burn the Southern Light to the ground. I will find you in whatever hell you've retreated to. A twitch. It was microscopic, a flutter of a finger against Klein's palm. Then, a sharp, gasping intake of air that sounded like a drowning man reaching the surface. Evan's eyes snapped open. The world was a blur of gray stone and flickering torchlight. His lungs burned, and his limbs felt like leaden weights, but as his vision cleared, he saw the most beautiful thing he had ever encountered in 2 lifetimes, Klein's face, wet with tears and twisted with a relief so violent it looked like pain. I told you. Evan croaked, his voice barely a shadow. I don't die easily. Klein didn't speak. He surged forward, crushing Evan into a hug so tight it threatened to break the very ribs he had just brought back to life. He buried his face in Evan's neck, shaking with a primal, silent sob. Never again, Klein breathed into his skin. I don't care about the laws. I don't care about the prophecies. If you ever try to leave me again, I will chain you to the throne. Evan let out a weak, genuine laugh, his hand shakily finding the back of Klein's head to stroke the dark hair. A bit possessive, don't you think? For a ruthless emperor. You made me this way, Klein countered, pulling back just enough to look Evan in the eye. The coldness was gone, replaced by a devastating, singular devotion. You hollowed me out and filled the space with yourself. There is no empire without you, Robert. There is only a cage. 1 month later. The great hall was packed, but the atmosphere was vastly different from the day of the execution. The high officials stood in uneasy silence, their eyes fixed on the figure standing beside the emperor. Robert Shaw was dead, officially struck down by the heavens. In his place stood a man the emperor had introduced as Evan Sanchez, a noble scholar from a distant land, who had been appointed as the Grand Vizier and the emperor's personal consort. The resemblance to the late advisor was purely coincidental, a lie so bold and backed by so much imperial steel that no one dared to whisper a word of dissent. Prince Julian had been invited to a remote monastery for a lifetime of silent prayer, and the northern duke's head now sat on a spike at the city gates. Evan stood on the dais, draped in robes of imperial gold and deep crimson. He looked out over the court, no longer a side character hiding in the margins, but the architect of a new narrative. Klein reached out, his gloved hand catching Evan's in front of the entire assembly. He didn't care about the optics. He didn't care about the scandal. He leaned in, his lips brushing Evan's ear. "Are you satisfied, my Grand Vizier?" Klein murmured. "You've manipulated the narrative, seduced the tyrant, and cheated death. Is there anything else your future knowledge says you need?" Evan looked at the man beside him, the villain who had become his protector, the monster who had learned to love. He squeezed Klein's hand, a slow, triumphant smile spreading across his face. "No," Evan whispered. "I think for the first time, I'm happy to let the next chapter be a surprise." The clock on Evan's life had stopped ticking toward his execution. Now, it was simply marking time for a reign that would be whispered about for centuries, the story of a doomed man who didn't just survive the villain, but conquered him. Thank you for listening under the same moon. If you'd like to hear more stories like this, you're always welcome here. Good night.